It's June 25th, 1876. We're beside the Little Bighorn River, known to the Lakota Sioux as the Valley of the Greasy Grass, where Crazy Horse senses victory. As Cheyenne and Lakota warriors smash Custer's troops at the riverside, Crazy Horse and his Lakotas swing around onto the ridgeline to the north, so that when Custer and his men fall back desperately across the rough ground, they're simply falling into a trap. It's difficult to know precisely what happens next, other than that it's a massacre. Building defensive works from stacks of slain horses, Custer and his men make their stand. They won't stand for long. In the minutes that follow, every member of Custer's 210-strong command is killed, either cut down in the sweat, blood and chaos on the hilltop, or slaughtered in the ravines and bluffs that surround the knoll. Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Chief Ghoul, and up to 2,500 warriors of the Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho groups have their victory. The mass killings at Sand Creek, at the Washita River, and at Mankato have been avenged. The Lakota have asserted their legal right over the territory, and a coalition of Plains cultures has successfully stood up against the US Army. But despite all the celebration, these warriors of the Plains Coalition have signed their own death warrants. Within a year, the United States will take away the land affirmed to the Lakota Sioux under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Cheyenne and Lakota will be moved to reservations, where their traditional culture will be repressed to the point of disappearance. Sitting Bull will flee to Canada, while Crazy Horse will die in controversial circumstances as he attempts to escape arrest. And to add insult to injury, the defeated Custer will be lionized in the eyes of the American people. For generations of schoolchildren, moviegoers, adventure novel readers, and even historians, George Armstrong Custer will become the hero of the Greasy Grass, the man who presided over the massacre at Washita, the man whose monumental arrogance saw 200 of his men, including his own 18-year-old nephew, slaughtered on the ridgeline north of the Little Bighorn. He will become an American hero. The Great Lakota and Cheyenne victory, on the other hand, will be more or less forgotten as they're denounced as savages, an accusation which will be used to justify the persecutions to come. This is the story of how George Armstrong Custer fought his last stand in June of 1876 on a knoll beside the Little Bighorn River. And it's also the story of how the victorious Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux warriors, in a sense, fought their own last stands along with him. It was late spring 1876 when the Lakota and Cheyenne held their Sundance at Rosebud Creek in Montana Territory. The Sundance was a great unifier for many of the Great Plains tribes. It was a chance for them to come together in a weeks-long festival of spiritual reflection and religious observance. Sometime around June 5th, Lakota leader Sitting Bull emerged shaken from his own Sundance. In a trance-like state, he'd received a startling vision. He'd witnessed enemy soldiers falling into his camp like grasshoppers from the sky. The vision was certainly disturbing, and receiving it during such a profoundly portentous ceremony as the Sundance would have chilled Sitting Bull to his core. But it couldn't come true, could it? After all, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 had promised this land to the Lakota. It was theirs, literally, under the law of the United States. In fact, of course, it could come true, and to an extent, it already was. The Black Hills Gold Rush began in 1874, with settlers and miners flooding into Lakota territory to seek their fortune. Among the first to arrive were 1,000 troopers of the 7th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer at their head. Lieutenant, if you're American. Custer was part military officer and part circus impresario. Known for his gaudy dress sense and his long flowing locks, this was a man who loved to be at the centre of attention. At times, he'd proved himself to be an effective soldier. He'd served with distinction at Gettysburg and received a flag of truce from General Lee's Confederate troops on their final retreat. But he was also supremely arrogant. He liked to wear the plume of an ostrich in his hat and pen exaggerated newspaper articles about his own exploits. And he took a dim view of Native Americans, and the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne in particular. Custer should, of course, understood the Lakota and Cheyenne. He'd had every opportunity to. He'd even met with the Southern Cheyenne directly in March 1869 and been welcomed by their leaders, Little Robe and Medicine Arrows. This did not stop him from breaking the trust of his hosts and taking 4 warriors captive. To be honest, Little Robe and Medicine Arrows should have expected this. It was not Custer's first betrayal of the Cheyenne. The previous year at Washita River, Custer had fought the Cheyenne under Black Kettle. He killed an unknown number of warriors and massacred women and children, using many as human shields. It was Custer who had become synonymous with the Great Sioux War of 1876. And it was Custer whose own violent demise would become so entwined with that of both the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne. But Custer was not the senior officer of this campaign. That distinction actually fell to Generals George Crook and Alfred Terry. In fact, it was General Crook who made the first action of the summer. On June 17th, at the Rosebud Creek, Crook's force, along with their Crow and Shoshone allies, took the field after a bitter battle with Crazy Horse's warriors. Despite their victory, Crook was disturbed by the sheer numbers and ferocity of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Unwilling to face a counterattack, they withdrew from the field. 2 things were now very clear to the US Army commanders. 1, there were huge numbers of warriors in the area, and 2, there was likely to be an encampment nearby, probably around the Bighorn or Little Bighorn rivers. For Custer and his 7th Cavalry Regiment, they were only interested in the latter. Failing to learn the lesson of Crook and his withdrawal at Rosebud Creek, he raced ahead with Captain Frederick Benteen and Major Marcus Reno in support, eager to find the encampment. He turned down the offer of Gatling guns as they would only slow him down. This was the first of Custer's fatal miscalculations. It took only a few days for Custer's scouts to sight the Cheyenne and Lakota encampment. When they returned, they were visibly shaken. Mitch Boyer, who was part French-Canadian and part Santee Sioux on his mother's side, said that this was the largest encampment he'd seen in 30 years. The Crow Scout, half yellow-face, reportedly told Custer, "You and I are going home today by a road we do not know." If Custer was scared by Half Yellowface's words, he certainly didn't show it. Rather than waiting for Terry's column to join him, he split his force and began his advance immediately on June 25th. Benteen would wait in reserve while Reno would cross the river and advance on the camp from the east. Custer himself would take 5 companies and push west along the high ground north of the river. He soon sighted the enormous encampment for himself. It seemed to be around 3 miles across, comprising thousands of tents. This was when he jotted down his now famous note to Benteen. "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." Now, Custer made his second miscalculation. Rather than waiting for Benteen's reinforcements, he pushed on, following the ridgeline westwards. Supposedly, Custer now cried, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them. We'll finish them up and then go home." This might seem a little overconfident, even for Custer, but don't forget he was a showman at heart and actually had newspaper reporters riding with him. He had one eye on the victory and one eye on the newspaper write-up. Meanwhile, Reno's 3 companies were on the move too. They forded the Little Bighorn at 3 p.m. and advanced along the river's southern bank. Rounding a copse of trees by the riverbank, Reno too sighted the camp for the first time. Finding it much larger than he'd expected, he dismounted his troops to form a skirmish line, firing volleys of shots into the eastern ridge of the village. It's possible that Custer could see Reno's advance from his position high to the north. He may have seen the Major's line on the east side of the encampment. The fact that Custer immediately galloped west suggests he had seen this line. It appears that he was trying to swing around and drive through the camp from the west, pushing the warriors onto Reno's force in a hammer and anvil maneuver. If this was his plan, then it was another one of his fatal errors. Reno's line was not going to hold. Unbeknownst to both Reno and Custer, warriors were now massing behind the hill off to the left of Reno's position. Cresting this rise, they smashed into the left-hand side of the line and then dove to the rear, cutting off his retreat. Reno was now in disarray. A chaotic fallback only took Reno's men as far as the brush beside the river to their north. Rather than pursue them into this entanglement, the warriors simply set it on fire, while taking potshots at them from nearby. It's believed Reno may have been drinking for hours by this point and was becoming disoriented. To make matters worse, his Arikara scout, named Bloody Knife, was known by the Lakota warriors and was a target. As the two desperately tried to come up with a plan, Bloody Knife was shot in the head. His blood and brains splattered over Reno's face in a hot cloud of gore. This was too much for the captain, who now seemed to lose his mind. He reportedly told his men to mount and then dismount, then mount once more. All the while, the companies were taking casualties as the Lakota fired into the wood. Finally, Reno gave the order to withdraw, and his shaken soldiers followed him in a disorderly fashion. They broke from the tree line and retreated northeast, hugging close to the curve of the river, before fording the Little Bighorn and sprinting for the cover of a ravine. The wounded were left behind, and stragglers were picked off by pursuing warriors. Now buoyed with confidence, the Cheyenne party got in close, hoisting fleeing men down from their horses and smashing their brains out with clubs. Fleeing desperately up the rise, Reno and his men ran right into Captain Benteen, who was advancing at Custer's behest. Benteen was shocked to see that 40 of Reno's 140-strong command had been killed, and a large number of stragglers were spread out along the line of retreat. While Benteen struggled to work out what was going on, a great roar on the horizon and the crackling of rifle reports quickly apprised from the situation to the west. Somewhere out there, Custer had engaged, and a bloody great fight was going on. On the approaches beneath them, the warriors, who had been pursuing Reno's men, suddenly turned and began moving west. They, too, were eager to join the fight. It's not quite clear why neither Reno nor Benteen advanced in support of Custer. Reno's nerves were shot, and it's possible he was simply in no position, mentally, to offer assistance. But Benteen had received an order from Custer, his superior, and now he was openly defying this order. He was holding his position and reinforcing Reno's shattered companies, instead of moving up in support. For whatever reason, no help was offered, and Custer's companies fought alone. According to Lakota and Cheyenne testimonies, the fight went like this. Custer and one company split from the main force on the ridgeline and pursued a band of warriors down Medicine Tail Coulee, right down to the river opposite the camp. James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, maintained his position on the high ground, advancing further west along the ridge. It's possible that Custer and his men were looking to snatch women and children from the village to use as human shields for a later assault, a tactic he'd used at Washita. This time, however, it didn't work. At the river, they began taking fire from sharpshooters in the camp on the other side. After a brief pause, they may have attempted to charge across the river. This was almost successful. This section of the camp was only thinly defended. A warrior named White Cow Bull identified someone he believed to be Custer riding at the head of the charge, along with a man matching Mitch Boyer's description. Some accounts suggest Custer himself fell while crossing the river, and it's certain that at least some troopers did. Several witnesses suggest that the attack force was repulsed at midstream and driven back up into the coulee. Buffalo Calf Road woman also claimed to have knocked Custer from his horse around this time. However, Custer had cut his famous long blonde hair and removed his distinctive jacket, so it would have been difficult for the Native American witnesses to recognize him for certain. As Custer's body was eventually found on the hilltop, some accounts may be cases of mistaken identity. What is clear, however, is that the soldiers who had reached the river now fell back. They fled across the rough and undulating terrain beneath the ridge, finally regrouping with Calhoun's companies at the crest. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse's force had returned from the route of Reno and was swinging far west and north to come at Custer from the other side. In other words, he was about to be surrounded. It's believed that Custer's force finally fell in at least 3 separate groups. Several companies who rallied around Captain Key likely died where they stood, several meters away to the east, refusing to budge as the warriors overwhelmed them. The others moved further west to what is now called Last Stand Hill. Here, Custer's force split once again. E Company attempted either a charge or a retreat, storming down the coulee at the west end of the ridge heading for the river. E Company, along with Custer and his two brothers, as well as his young nephew and around 40 others, remained on the crest of the hill. Here, they stacked the bodies of their horses high, creating rudimentary breastworks from which they fired back at their assailants. Crazy Horse's forces were now in position and attacking the ridgeline from the north, while Chief Gall's warriors harried Custer's men from the south. Anyone still alive now had no escape. While Lakota and Cheyenne accounts suggest many of their warriors lost their lives here, the fight couldn't have actually gone on for that long. Amid the blood and the dust of the battle, the warriors took the hill, and took no prisoners. Wounded men had their skulls shattered by mallets, the corpses were mutilated, and scalps were taken. The heart of Custer's brother Thomas was reportedly cut from his chest. No survivors. By around 5:30 p.m., it's likely that Custer's fight was over. Now, Lakota and Cheyenne bands bore down on Benteen and Reno's remaining companies in the east. For the remainder of the night and into the following day, Benteen and Reno had to repel attacks from groups of warriors. They were essentially kept under siege until General Terry's column relieved them on June 27th. Reno's ongoing defense, along with Benteen, helped rescue his reputation, but only by a little. For years after, the coward tag stuck to him. This is probably unfair. Putting the allegation of drunkenness to one side, Reno had been soundly defeated on the riverbank, and was certainly in a state of shock as he fell back to the ridge. He likely thought his depleted force could only offer little by way of assistance. Still, a series of disgraces dogged the remainder of his military career, as did problems with drink. He was eventually dishonourably discharged, and died in 1889 with his reputation in tatters. Benteen's force was perhaps in better shape to help Custer out, but by that point in the battle, Custer had raced so far ahead of the other companies that Benteen would have struggled to reach him in time. Out of all of the American commanders at Little Bighorn, it was Custer whose reputation came out of the massacre best, at least initially. In the years that followed the battle, Custer became a symbol of courage and valour, a truly aspirational figure for young Americans. This is even though he'd led 5 companies of troopers to their deaths and had charged on ahead in search of his own glory rather than military victory. The reason for Custer's lasting fame is partly due to his wife, Libby Bacon Custer. It seems that he was not the only self-promoter in the family. Almost immediately after her husband's death, she published A Popular Life of General Custer and followed this up with Boots and Saddles in 1885. These books helped popularize the myth of the swashbuckling soldier who led from the front and died alongside his men. When Frederick Benteen decried Custer's arrogance and reckless endangerment of his men, Libby responded with a pamphlet. The American public much preferred the words of the widow Libby over those of the man who'd served alongside Custer. When forced to choose between fact and legend, in this instance, the public chose the legend. For journalist Olivia B. Waxman, there's another reason why Custer has become a mythological cipher for bravery in the face of certain death. No one from Custer's 5 companies survived the battles, and Mark Kellogg, a journalist from the Bismarck Tribune who'd been covering Custer that summer, was also killed in the fight. This left a lot of gaps to fill in over the years, and opportunities to reframe the defeat. And reframe they did. With Libby Custer at the forefront of the movement to rehabilitate him, Custer's reputation grew and grew over the decades that followed. Long into the following century, film treatment starring Errol Flynn and Robert Shaw basically immortalized Custer as a heroic ideal. Even today, when Custer's arrogance and pomposity are hardly a secret, the suicidal folly of his last stand is still viewed positively by many. But what about the other side? How did the Lakota and Cheyenne fare after the battle? Well, the victory at Little Bighorn was the last, and indeed only, great victory of the Sioux War. The campaign would be over by early 1877, and did not end well for the Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux. In the words of historian Lindsay Stallone's Marshall, the defeat at Little Bighorn spurred the United States to protect what they termed innocent settlers from Native American warriors who became the villains of the story and who stood in the way of westward expansion. What textbooks don't necessarily teach students is that the settlers were there illegally. The area had been promised to the Lakota Nation for all time. The settlers were there against U.S. treaty law, and the native people were rightly defending themselves. Such ideas were not really considered in 1876. Rather than feeling sympathy or understanding, Americans hearing about the battle back east were largely appalled. Warriors had taken scalps and trophies from dead soldiers at the Little Bighorn, which was their custom after a victory. All of this, however, reinforced the idea of the savage warrior who must be civilized. Of course, a brave white soldier in the blue uniform of the Union could never do such a thing, conveniently forgetting that John Chivington's 3rd Colorado Cavalry had done exactly that at Sand Creek in 1864. As they rode out of Sand Creek, stepping over the corpses of up to 600 Cheyenne and Arapaho, the horses, guns, and packs of Chivington's men were decked out with trinkets, things like scalps, male and female genitalia, and fetuses ripped from the wombs of mothers. Many of these trophies were displayed in Denver saloons for years after the event. And there's no denying the fact that Custer and his men died horribly. Their final minutes would have been spent in complete terror as the reality dawned on them that this time there was no way out. They would have seen their friends and comrades cut down in front of them. The Custer brothers may have even seen their 18-year-old nephew Henry Reed killed and then mutilated before their very eyes. But such scenes are not unusual in war. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought ruthlessly and showed no mercy to an enemy that they knew would show them none in return. And from a military perspective, you could argue this might have been justified. But the Lakota and Cheyenne history was an oral one. It was passed down in story and song. The Americans, on the other hand, wrote their history. They splashed it across newspaper headlines and magazine features and sent it around the world. They spun and twisted the truth to create their own mythologies. The myth that the Lakota and Cheyenne were savages, and that the West must be civilized. And so, what should have been a great victory for the Lakota and the Cheyenne became a death knell for their nations.